Rapid Fire works great with these two hearts. It has huge AoE damage and it's something that Rapid Fire was always missing. It destroys elites and bosses even faster than before, and also you have a high survivability. Oops, wrong footage. But jokes aside, even grinding nightmare dungeons like 30 levels higher than my character is not a problem with this build, even though I don't have all the optimal items yet. So how it works? Usually we cast a subterfuge skill and all the enemies are getting taunted, because this heart creates a shadow copy of you which attracts enemies and they are not attacking it, they just go to it, so you're not gonna die from some AoE. Even ranged enemies are gonna go to this shadow copy. So while they are ignoring you, you attack them with rapid fire, make a critical strike, and here our next heart steps in. Because such enemy will absorb all the damage and after some time there will be an explosion which will release all the stored damage and amplify it by 13-14% per each second. That's where we get this huge AoE damage from, and it sounds pretty simple, but there are few problems with this heart. It works in a very weird way. For example, when enemy is absorbing damage, most effects from your skills or from aspects that have lucky hit in it will not work. I said most, but not all. Here are a few examples. Let's say you have exploit glyph equipped on your Paragon board and you have this additional bonus. When enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. You attack your enemy with rapid fire and very first arrow is a critical strike. Your enemy will not become vulnerable because there was no damage yet. In a few seconds when there will be an explosion, this explosion will make enemies around vulnerable, but until then exploit will not work. Next example, we are using cold imbuement with enhanced cold imbuement improvement. In this case, even though we are not making damage, there is a chance that we will make enemies vulnerable. Because you see, description is not talking about making damage or making a critical strike. It literally says cold imbued skills have up to 40% chance to make enemies vulnerable on a lucky hit. So against enemies affected by this heart, fundamental puncture is useless because you see hitting an enemy, and forceful arrow is useful because every third cast makes enemy vulnerable, not talking about damage or critical strike. It's important to know because you want your enemies to be vulnerable all the time, even after nerf in Season 1, actually especially after nerf in Season 1. As for the second heart, I need to mention that there is a delay between you casting a skill and enemies being taunted, so be careful, and also it has 5-second cooldown. Now let's talk about the build itself, skills, important aspects and Paragon Board. And yes, link to the whole build in the description. We don't use basic skill at all, instead we are making all the damage with rapid fire. As for improvements, two options here. When you only leveling up and don't have any ways to restore energy, especially since you're not using basic skill, I suggest you to use improved rapid fire. It's a great way to get energy back. But then when you will find some good aspect, for example this one, which will allow you to keep your energy at maximum level pretty much all the time, switching to advanced rapid fire would be a smart choice because it's a lot of additional critical strike damage and all this build is around critical strike damage. Next we have 3 subterfuge skills that we want to use every 5 seconds to taunt enemies. Poison trap is an obvious choice to knock down enemies and poison them, which is great for disobedience aspect, is still a great aspect even after nerf. Concealment is our way to survive because it's not only stealth, it also grants us unstoppable, so we can cast it even when stunned, you know, in the most dangerous situations. Plus it restores quite a lot of energy, but the most importantly, it's another way to apply vulnerable to our enemies, even to those enemies who are affected by Barber Heart. And the third one is a smoke grenade, which not only dazes enemies, and you know it's always cool because dazed enemies are not attacking you, they don't use any skills, but also enemies affected by smoke grenade take 20% increased damage. It was buffed, used to be 15%, and also with help of this aspect our smoke grenade counts as a trap skill, and you will see that there are some additional bonuses, important bonuses against enemies affected by trap skill in this build. By the way, you can cast smoke grenade from a pretty big range, so it's a great way to initiate the fight. I'm using a cold imbuement to freeze enemies because because frozen enemies are not attacking you as well. Plus we're making a lot of extra damage to frozen and chilled enemies. And yes, I already mentioned this extremely important improvement for cold imbuement. Ultimate is Shadow Clone, a lot of extra damage and another way to become unstoppable. And our key passive is obviously a precision. We need a lot of extra critical strike damage and we getting it from a precision. As for other passives, they're pretty standard, you know, weapon mastery, melee, stuff like that is just a must-have. Again, you can check all the details of this build by following link in the description, but I need to mention something. I have 9 points in exploit, 3 from bow and 3 from amulet. And in my opinion, for this build, exploit is probably the most important passive skill, because it increases damage to healthy and injured enemies. And you know what? We mostly will be fighting healthy or injured enemies, because how it works, you attack your enemy, make a critical strike, and all the damage it receives until an explosion counts as a damage to healthy enemy. And then if explosion is not killing your enemy instantly, which usually will happen to elites and bosses, it still will do so much damage that your target will become injured pretty fast and you will again receive this sweet bonus from exploit passive. As for specialization, I'm using preparation. I think it's a great combination with rapid fire. We spend a lot of energy by spamming rapid fire all the time, so we will reset our ultimate relatively fast and then we will cast Shadow Clone and will reset cooldowns of our skills, including concealment, which is the most important. Now the most important items and aspects. As a main weapon, I'm using Sky Hunter bow, because unlike most unique items for rogue, it has a pretty good stats. You see dexterity, marksman skill damage, critical strike damage, exploit, it's like a pretty good stats. Additionally, first damage you deal to an enemy is a guaranteed critical strike, but unfortunately it only applies to the first arrow of rapid fire, yet it's still great because we have Barber Heart. Also sometimes you will restore a little bit of energy because of precision key passive. If you don't have Sky Hunter yet, it's not a problem, just use another good bow, or which is even better, crossbow, and apply aspect of repeating on it, which will improve your rapid fire. By the way, it's also a must-have aspect. Unfortunately, it's pretty hard to find, so I have a really weak version so far. Few defensive aspects are really good, for example, damage reduction from crowd control the enemies or disobedience, and I would love to have disobedience on amulet, because yes, it was nerfed, but it's still pretty good. As I already mentioned, this aspect for resource management will be a great choice. Edge Masters is also a great choice because it will give you extra damage, and rest aspects are optional. For example, I'm using this one, which grants Shadow Clone additional damage. Frostbitten aspect as another way of making enemies frozen and also receiving extra critical strike damage. And this one because if elites will not die, they will become unstoppable and you will need some extra damage against them. As for stats, we prioritize critical strike chance, critical strike damage and vulnerable damage. And gems are pretty standard. Rubies for our armor to receive extra health and emeralds for our weapons. Now Paragon, on the first board I'm using combat for extra critical strike damage, which applies not only to core skill now but to any damage. On the second board I have an exploit for extra vulnerable damage and also legendary node Deadly Ambush for additional critical strike damage to enemies affected by trap skills, which is not only a poison trap but also a smoke grenade. Additionally, I'm using a ranger glyph, which gives us not only extra damage to rapid fire but also a damage reduction because we're using a ranged weapon. Next I have an ambush, even more damage to enemies affected by trap skills, plus legendary node No Witnesses, which not only grants increased damage to our ultimate skill but also gives us 10% increased damage for 20 seconds after casting an ultimate. And the last one is control, extra damage to crowd controlled enemies and even more extra damage to frozen and chilled enemies. Now, few things to mention. First of all, which version of the caged heart of the barber should we choose, with 2 sec seconds or with 4 seconds? My answer is with 4 seconds, because you see, explosion will happen if amount of stocked damage is higher than enemy's health, so you will basically kill a lot of trash mobs almost immediately. And against tougher enemies like hard elites and bosses, you want this heart's effect to last for as long as possible, because you will be able to stock more damage, amplifier will be higher, and which is also important, you will be fighting healthy enemies all the time, before the explosion will happen at least. And the second question is, can we use this build in PvP? And the answer is no, it's just not a good build for PvP. There are some good rapid fire builds for PvP, there are a lot of good twisting blades builds for PvP, but this one is just not. Anyway, I hope you will enjoy this build, it's fun, it's powerful, it's easy to play, you can grind pretty high level nightmare dungeons with it easily, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, stay safe, stay healthy, goodbye.